Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Policy Pulse, which is a podcast series of the Chaudhry Nazar Muhammad Department of Economics at Lahore University of Management Sciences. I'm Laila Khalid and I'm a lecturer at the CNM Department of Economics at LUMS. This podcast series is an initiative of the department which is meant to shed light into key development issues facing Pakistan and offer policy recommendations based on the research conducted by our faculty members. Today, we are looking at a very different aspect and a very profound challenge facing Pakistan and everywhere around the globe, which is the issue of misinformation. Social media has changed the way people communicate with each other and has the power to affect human behavior, health, and societal outcomes. While the spread of false information has been propagated throughout human history, it is all the more relevant today because studies suggest that false information diffuses faster and further, particularly with regards to social media. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Aisha Ali here with us to talk about her research on countering misinformation. Dr. Ali is an assistant professor at the CNM Department of Economics at LUMS. She has completed her PhD in economics from University of Toronto and has also completed her MA in International Policy Studies from Stanford University, also an MA in Economics from the University of British Columbia. She is an applied development economist, and one of her areas of research is digital economies, explaining how digital technologies such as the internet, social media, and recently artificial intelligence affect behaviors and socio-economic and political outcomes in the developing world. We have quite an impressive set of research coming from her, and I'm excited to share that her research on misinformation has been published in leading international journals, including Nature Human Behavior, Journal of Development Economics, and Harvard Kennedy Misinformation Review. So thank you for the opportunity, Dr. Aisha.
Thank you so much, Laila, and it's a pleasure to be here.
I'd like to begin with asking you to talk a bit about what misinformation is and the challenges it poses to us in today's age of extreme social media usage.
Laila, as you described in your introduction, misinformation has really become a global phenomena in the age of the internet and social media. So we've always lived in a world where there's false propaganda, there's always sort of this idea of false information out there. But social media has really sort of amplified those narratives. There's a lot more explosive sort of increase in the generation of fake content as well as the consumption of it and the dissemination of it, right? So it's become really easy for anyone to sort of post, any unverified piece of information, and and as you've said, that type of news, it's emotional, it's provocative, people tend to engage more with it. It just becomes viral, right? And social media algorithmic sort of, the way that social media algorithms work is that they will show you content that you're likely to engage with, right? And that sort of really, again, amplifies the reach of misinformation, making it the negative consequences of it sort of, much larger than what we would have had in just an offline world. So just to give you some understanding of, what the literature is showing, the rise of social media and misinformation has been correlated with increasing polarization. So more extreme views, a lot sort of extremism in the political realm, but also sort of, other aspects, for example, thinking of the way that we consume information online. We're seeking information constantly, be it about health decisions, economic decisions, financial decisions. So all of those are likely to be affected when we have distorted beliefs. And that's what misinformation or fake content, essentially achieves, right? It really sort of, misleads people into believing things which may not be true and then exposes them to potential harms. Health misinformation is, I think, a leading example of this, and there's a lot of sort of work showing that, what happened in the COVID-19 pandemic, and also sort of generally sort of around everyday health behaviors that people tend to sort of really kind of believe, a lot of false content related to health and that can have potentially, large negative consequences for them. But also this phenomena of sort of, us living in now in a post-truth world, where people really sort of, they react to, or they're likely to believe or be more responsive to emotional arguments or to ideological arguments, rather than thinking of sort of things like facts, or objective pieces of information that may contradict their prior beliefs. Right, so we're really kind of moving into that space where, we are sort of in this era where, we are really sort of living by these emotional and ideological sort of, appeals that's becoming more and more prevalent. And there's also research which shows that, the more you're exposed to this kind of false content, you're actually likely to come to believe that it's true. This is called the illusory truth effect. Okay, and this is one of the sort of ways that misinformation has really sort of been having, these far-reaching negative effects on what people think. So one of the key sort of, first order effect is that misinformation is really affecting people's beliefs. It's affecting public opinions. And then in some cases, it's leading to sort of downstream effects in terms of their offline behaviors, right? And we discussed about health, but also sort of political outcomes. Also, there's some sort of, evidence about social sort of interactions as well in the offline space that, it's really sort of leading to these negative and harmful effects.
Thanks very much. So I think it's clear that it has far-reaching consequences for all of us. And I'd actually like to ask you that in one of your papers, you quote statistics that 50% of the population lacks basic digital skills across 40 developing countries. Now, given such an explosive growth in social media adoption in developing countries, do you feel that deepening the digital literacy base will have a positive impact here on outcomes?
Leila, I think digital literacy is one of the sort of, key characteristics of users that we study. Users, by users, I mean people who are on social media, people who are using internet or digital technologies. And digital literacy is not just their ability to use technology, sort of, the hardware of it, or even sort of, the sort of beyond that. It's more so about information literacy. Are they able to sort of effectively find information in the digital space? Can they critically evaluate information, specifically thinking about sources or how credible the information might be? And also, can they responsibly and safely sort of use the digital space? Just to give you an example, thinking of something like privacy settings, right? So how many people might be aware what privacy settings do, or like, what that might have effect in terms of what data is being monitored and gathered by social media platforms from your engagements, and how it may be further stored and shared with third parties, etc. Right? So things like that, or even something which we see a lot, which is let's say we see a piece of news or information and it has a label on it, forwarded many times, right? What does it say about the credibility of that type of information, right? So having an understanding of how to evaluate the information in the digital space is one of the key aspects of digital literacy, which is going to then make people more resilient to fake news or misinformation, right? So we did a study with Facebook users here in Lahore in Pakistan. We had 600 people in our sample, and we actually found that we measured digital literacy before we did our test, in which we had them do a task where they were looking at different pieces of news and rating them as true or false. So it's essentially giving us accuracy judgments on different pieces of news. And these were real sort of news items which had been recently circulating on social media. And we found that the more digitally literate Facebook users were actually better able to identify misinformation. So they had more accurate beliefs. So, thinking of, what can be done in this regard, different countries have been actually moving in this direction already. Many countries in the OECD, the Western European countries, and also in East Asia, they've already been sort of integrating digital literacy modules into curriculum, and also sort of really focusing on youth and high school and college going students as well, to sort of build these kind of skills and resilience in terms of evaluating information, being able to sort of be responsible digital citizens in this age.
Okay, absolutely. So, if we talk about the challenge of countering misinformation, what are the different kinds of interventions that can build resilience to and maybe help in mitigating the spread of false information? And what can be done in this particular regard?
Leila, that's an excellent question. I think misinformation is a multifaceted problem. So we need then a multi-pronged solution or different ways in which we tackle it. I'll talk about two different ways which really kind of tie in with the way we as economists think of, why these kind of externalities or digital harms are coming about, right? So one is the supply side of misinformation or fake news, which is essentially, where is this coming from, right? I talked a bit about social media lowering the barriers to entry in terms of individuals being able to post content without verification, without editorial oversight, right? So that's one part of it. But also, if you think about it, the social media platforms themselves, they actually do not have an incentive to curtail misinformation. Indirectly, what is their incentive? Their incentive is essentially to sort of maximize advertising revenue, which comes from more user engagement. So actually their incentive is to maximize user engagement, right? And the way that they're operating, they're essentially sort of gathering information based on your historical engagement, and they're trying to kind of even micro target content to you, right? So we know already about algorithms which customize your news feeds, right? But also sort of thinking of going further in the future, where you're actually being shown really micro targeted content, not just in terms of the news itself, but also advertisements, etc. And everything that you see is really sort of customized to what you've done in the past, right? Based on what the social media knows according to the interactions you've had over there. So in this case, we know that on the supply side, there are a lot of sort of these misaligned incentives, essentially, which means that social media platforms by themselves will not have an incentive to regulate themselves or to control these digital harms. So we need some form of oversight, some form of regulation, and then that has to sort of look at how we can control the supply of misinformation, right? Be it something like content moderation, right? So making that more strict, where, right now, typically the standard is that content is flagged and it goes to human content evaluators, and then, it may come back with a sort of fact check that it's false, misleading, or true, etc., right? So this is one of the model, right? Or we could think of sort of more proactive models where, such content, let's say through help of large language models or generative AI is automatically being flagged, right? So, but we need some way in which regulation can occur, and the supply of misinformation can be curtailed. On the demand side, because it's not what I've talked about so far, but in fact, all of my research is on the demand side. This is essentially the point at where you see the content, right? And you're consuming it and you're interacting with it, right? So on the demand side, the way that would control or curtail misinformation is by making people more resilient to such content, right? You see it, you don't believe it, you just move on, right? You don't engage with it, right? And how can that come about? Well, I have a paper in Nature Human Behavior where we look at a body of evidence. We were reviewing all kinds of different interventions that have been tried both in developing and developed world to essentially make consumers more resilient. So it's sort of like a toolbox of demand side interventions. It ranges from things like light touch accuracy nudges. So on your news feed, you may get message saying that, check the accuracy before sharing, or some other kind of light nudge which sort of makes you more aware of what you're about to do in terms of your engagement with the content, right? There are other approaches where you can, for example, build competence, build digital literacy, build media literacy, as we've discussed. That is one of the sort of key factors which makes people more resilient to misinformation, right? Having more competence. And that's sort of like it's a more cognitively demanding process in the sense that, it's not a nudge, do this or do that. It's more like, teaching you certain skills so that, when you encounter this type of content, you can actually recognize it for what it is, okay? In some way, it may have longer term effects than just a nudge, which could be temporary, okay? Then there are other ways in which we can sort of build competence and resilience. For example, one way which is sort of borrowing from the medical science literature, it's called psychological inoculation, where you teach people in a way that you expose them to false content or you show them fake news, and then you tell them, how the fake news generator, the content generator, what kind of strategies they adopted to actually deceive people. So they're sort of very commonly sort of deployed behavioral strategies, for example, false dichotomy or attacking, doing personal attacks, or, these kind of behavioral strategies, which is deployed a lot by fake content generators. So psychological inoculation would work in that way, that you're being taught, again, your competency is being built, right? So these are some of the examples of what I call demand-side interventions, which, as the evidence currently shows, they hold a lot of promise in building sort of, longer-term resilience against misinformation.
So let's talk a bit about the role of education, especially with regards to Pakistan. And especially, I would like you to take us through some of your results from the experiment that you conducted to test the effectiveness of educational interventions here.
Ji Leila, so this was something I became interested in, back in around 2018, 2019. This was about the time when, the interest in misinformation, ways to counter it, why it exists, what kind of effects there are. It was just gaining traction. There's not a lot of work. In fact, one of our first studies, which we did in 2019, was actually the first study from the global south or the developing world, which could show in a rigorous scientific manner that, what kind of effect do educational interventions have. So our goal was really to sort of see whether educational interventions, as I've been discussing, digital literacy competencies or media literacy competencies, educating people about that, can it actually make them more resilient? So the first experiment that we did, we recruited about 1,000 social media users, and we were essentially, we had a couple of surveys with them. We did a baseline, then we followed up. In the baseline, we did a small experiment with them where we divided them randomly into 3 groups. One was a control or status quo group, which does not get any educational intervention. The second one was a group where we give them simple tips delivered through a video. These tips were essentially, there was a list of 7 tips, very similar to what Facebook used to have a while back. Facebook also had these tips for recognizing fake news. So very similar to that, and these were just shown and we left. In the third group, what we did was that we gave the tips, but we also had them do a small task where they were looking at some recent pieces of misinformation and telling us about what they thought, whether it was true or false, and then we gave them feedback. Look, this is false because of X, Y, Z. Right? Look at the source. Look, this thing is missing. The photo is photoshopped or looks fake, etc. Right? And then in our follow-up surveys, we have them do similar tasks where they're rating a list of news stories as true or false. So essentially, that gives us a measure of their accuracy judgment about news which they might encounter online. And so what we find is that relative to the control group, just doing the tips alone, just giving the tips alone, and then just that one short intervention, that does not have any effect. The tips plus this feedback that we give them, when they complete a task and we tell them about why a piece of news is true or fake, that had a statistically significant and quite large effect, right? If we think about how this intervention compares to other interventions which I've described, like nudges or like inoculation, etc. So that combination of giving them some education, but also giving them some extra practice and then feedback in terms of actually doing this task and looking at and trying to kind of spot those pieces of giveaways which are typically there in fake content, was really helpful for these social media users. And Leila, we were really working with people who were very low digital literacy users. We did a small digital literacy module to assess their skills, and we found that mostly people were sort of on the bottom end of the spectrum. So we are really kind of talking about people with already low digital literacy skills, and so the experiment showed that there's a lot of potential, a lot of promise that these type of interventions hold in building resilience and competency at the individual level.
Sort of analysis, and it sheds light into a lot of interventions that can be done to sort of counter the issue of misinformation currently. I'd also like to talk about the advancement of artificial intelligence and software programs, because of which we're experiencing forms of deepfake technology, which is now posing considerable challenges to lawmakers and enforcers. Could you please shed some light into what deepfake is and how is it amplifying threats to individuals?
Ji Leila, excellent question. So deepfakes, as you know, they're essentially very problematic because they're copying someone's identity. And typically, it's a public figure, whose identity is being copied, and the message that's being given is sort of really meant to defame or to create a scandal, or some really sort of outlandish piece of information is being given to create sort of chaos and mistrust among people. So there's a lot of concern around deepfakes, and with the advancements recently that we're seeing with large language models, the capabilities and the sort of output of these, the quality of these deepfakes has really improved. We did another experiment a while back, before the sort of, proliferation of LLMs, which have really made deepfakes much more sophisticated now. And in that experiment, we had about 3,000 people, where we essentially, the novelty was that we were exposing them to different formats of news content. So news content in the form of screenshots, or in the form of audio, or in the form of, what we call deepfake videos, right? And then we were asking them about, their accuracy judgments. So we found that, and we, in this experiment, we focused just on political news. So we really kind of just sort of focused in the domain of political misinformation. We found that in this particular sample, misinformation presented in deepfake form was no more sort of convincing than misinformation in other forms. So there was no statistically significant difference. People had similar sort of level of ability to recognize misinformation as a deepfake versus misinformation presented, let's say, as a screenshot. But what was interesting was that their accuracy judgment for deepfakes or videos in which the political figure they support, right? We asked them before we did this experiment in the baseline. We asked them which political party they identify the most with, right? So if the deepfake video is about it represents the political figure they support, and the political figure they support is making a statement, a negative statement about a rival, and people were more likely to believe it, right? So deepfakes were more convincing in that particular sort of segment of type of fake news, which again signals that so deepfakes do remain problematic, because the kind of deepfake content you'd observe is typically trying to sort of defame let's say the opposition or a rival party or a rival public figure. So in that particular regard, I think this remains an area which actually requires more research. And I think, we continue to sort of work on this and to study people's perceptions about this type of content and how persuasive it can be.
Right, absolutely. So when you say, political figures and how deepfake, you can see the reliance on that in terms of political campaigns and near elections. So I think again, the issue of misinformation and how to deal with it seems all the more relevant, because this is something that we're going to see more and more unless we take proper measures now to sort of control the spread of such news. So moving on, Aisha, I'd like to talk a bit about the health sector. We know that the health sector is plagued with prior beliefs and concepts of various health outcomes, and some of these are generational beliefs which have been passed to us over time. Challenges healthcare workers face in vaccination programs, for example, are immense. frontline workers still find campaigns against some diseases particularly difficult to implement in parts of the country. So here I'd like to talk about the health sector, particularly with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic and your work that talks about misinformation. I think when the COVID-19 outbreak happened, globally the world was divided in its views about the vaccine, and your work talks about misinformation, and I'd like to discuss that a bit further and ask you to share some findings from that particular study.
Thank you for that question, Leila. And I must admit that this is one of the sort of subtopics within the broader misinformation space that I also really enjoyed kind of working in. So the key piece of research we did with respect to health misinformation was during the pandemic, where we did a phone survey, and we were just trying to assess how much people had been exposed to misinformation about the pandemic. So we had a list of claims or news stories, you may say, about the pandemic, and it was a mix of true and false, right? And for each we asked people, again, sort of like your accuracy judgment task, whether they thought it was true or not. And we realized for the false pieces of information or the COVID-19 fake news, everybody had been exposed to it. And there was a very high proportion of people who were, essentially had fallen prey to it. So that was interesting, but, I think that was sort of like a common finding across the world about this. And it actually is common not just in health, but I would say it applies in situations whenever there's uncertainty. For example, think of the recent conflict between Pakistan and India, right? So in these types of situations, people are actually seeking out information and seeking out news. But it's very hard to verify, and things are really uncertain. Things are also moving very fast, etc. Right? So similarly, in the pandemic, we hadn't seen anything like this in our lifetime. So, there was a lot of misinformation around it. One of the interesting pieces of further evidence we found with this phone survey was that we measured something which is called a cognitive reflection capability. It's essentially a psychology, it's a behavioral psychology test, which is very standardized, and it's sort of like a series of 4 or 5 questions. But what it gives you at the end is that, your propensity to be more deliberative. So if you're given a piece of news or information, how much do you deliberate about it and think about it versus giving an intuitive response or a gut feeling or something maybe that is your prior belief about the topic, right? So using that diagnostic, we split our sample into 2 groups, people who had more propensity to engage in cognitive reasoning and people who had lower propensity. So what we found was, not surprisingly, people who were less cognitively reflective or relying more on their intuition, gut feeling or prior belief, they were the ones more likely to be prey to or fall for COVID-19 misinformation. And we also did a follow-up where we were looking at what was their willingness to pay for masks. So in that group, the willingness to pay for masks or, the willingness to pay for engaging in preventative behavior against the pandemic was also lower, right? So what did that tell us? Essentially, one of the things we learned was that, people in this space, they are going to rely a lot on their prior belief, a lot on what they've heard, or maybe a lot on what is the accepted norm in their social group, right? And one of the ways which it comes again from a broader literature, not just our work on misinformation, but specifically looking at things like, vaccination uptake, is that seeding good information in your sort of reference group or through trusted, let's say, leaders. This could be religious leaders or social leaders, community leaders, any types of leaders, or even celebrities, actually. That can be really powerful way to essentially, give those people who are really sort of going with the heuristic or intuitive gut feeling and falling for fake news, give them, a greater chance in terms of, being more discerning.
Absolutely. So sometimes you just need reassurance from some figure, and this, I believe, would sort of help in this particular regard. So talking about misinformation as a global issue, what can we say about how the issue has been addressed by policymakers in a global context?
Leila, I feel that so I talked previously about the regulation aspect of it, right? So because the on the supply side, the social media platforms, the fake news content generators, they essentially have no incentive to limit this kind of content, right? So that's why we need regulation, right? And there have been waves of sort of, in terms of policy and regulation with respect to social media content. So, for example, after the 2016 and 2020 US presidential election, there was greater scrutiny of social media companies. So they came under a lot of pressure and they had to make content moderation more strict. But recently we see a reversal of that, right? Where they're kind of really stepping back, and now the narrative is that we need to let there be free speech on social media, etc., right? So as I see it, regulation response of platforms has really responded to these kind of, waves of, let's say, political pressure or, perhaps, public pressure. So that's a reality that, we are going to be living with. Close to home in Pakistan, most of the time our approach has actually been around regulation, which is centered on censorship or blocking content, right? And this is one of the other ways through which, platforms or ultimately governments are trying to control, what information is available to the citizens of their country. So this is another approach. But again, it can be limited to the extent that blocked content again can be accessible through VPNs, etc., right? The approach that we sort of tend to advocate for, which is admittedly going to have sort of longer term effects and maybe sort of more effective in longer term as well, is building resilience, right? So while you look at the supply side, you try to have a balance of, regulation which lets there be free speech or sort of unhindered flow of information while sort of blocking harmful content. But you also simultaneously think about raising people's competencies, right? Building resilience, and again, sort of thinking of the whole sort of, range of demand side interventions that could be operationalized to essentially achieve an equilibrium where we have low proliferation of misinformation.
So I think consistency is the key here, probably, and whatever measures a government takes or a political party takes need to be seen through over time, so that if we are making any progress towards finding a solution to this issue, that isn't reversed. So I think it would be good to have some kind of consistency in terms of policy making and. So, talking a bit more about this, so what type of policy recommendations would you suggest in this particular area?
One of the key pieces of policy recommendations, again, as I've been saying throughout the podcast, would be to focus on media literacy interventions and building them into curricula right from the sort of, years of, like, let's say, high school, into college, university, etc. So reaching young people at an early age, making them, raising their competencies and making them, helping them navigate digital spaces in a safe and responsible way, in a discerning way, right? While still benefiting from the sort of positive opportunities that these technologies afford. Secondly, so I think, this is already happening, with different private actors, NGOs, etc. They've been, on small scale, trying to kind of get these type of initiatives off the ground. But I think there would be a lot of value for, let's say, governments, provincial governments, to step in and to maybe standardize this and to include it across the board for all types of schools and curriculum. Secondly, sort of having more transparency around regulation, right? So whether your regulation is blocking or whether your regulation is content moderation, having more transparency in terms of, telling the citizens, telling the world that, this is what we're doing and is it being effective or not, right? How much fake content is being stopped, etc., right? So thinking of the transparency and having some way for us to be able to evaluate, what is the effect of these regulatory policies, both for social media platforms, right? So they should be doing it for themselves as well, but as well for governments who are, approaching social media platforms and, essentially requiring them to abide by certain regulations. So I think this would essentially create a more informed discourse around what kind of regulation is likely to work, which balances the sort of, two goals, free speech versus, let's say, prevention of harm, right? And that also needs to be context specific. What will work in a country like Pakistan is going to be different than what may work elsewhere, right? So those are my two broad pieces of policy recommendations. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think, as you say, because digital literacy and social media usage, this starts from an early age now. So I think it would be good to incorporate it as part of the curriculum and start educating students early on, so that they're able to discern fake news from the actual real information from an early age, and they have the tools which are essential for them in this regard. So in the end, I'd like to ask you, what would be your advice to the youth of the country?
I don't have a lot of advice, but based off this sort of body of work, what I can say is that one should always be discerning, right? Be careful while consuming content online. Do not be swayed by emotions. Do not be swayed by appeals to ideology. So always be discerning. Fact check if you can, right? And always think before sort of sharing or passing along any piece of news. I would also suggest that in the offline space, I see a lot of young people interact and engage a lot in the online space. But I would also encourage that maybe those debates also need to happen offline. So a lot of the debate and discourse can, if that is happening offline, that actually allows for more engagement with whoever may have opposing views, and probably that can sort of, be one step in making us more tolerant of different views, understanding different perspectives, and hopefully reduce polarization that we see so much in today's world.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this insightful discussion, Aisha, and for your insight into initiatives and endeavors that should be taken with regards to misinformation. So thank you for being here with us.